All right. Well, welcome all. Excited to have you, and thank you for getting here at 8 a.m. For gender differentiated impacts of land tenure security in Africa, one of the first parallel track sessions for the research track conference of the World Bank Land Conference. I'm Michael Sullivan, delighted to have today as our first speaker, Alessia Usopi, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Manchester. She's also worked at the World Bank in a previous life on aid effectiveness and DEC-RG, and her research interests now focus on asymmetric information, property rights, and institutions. And she'll get us started with this paper on bargaining power and inheritance norms. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of you for being here at 8 o'clock. This paper, as the title says, is about bargaining power in international, and we look at polygamous household next year. The co-author is also a friend of mine. It's Jennifer Golan from the University of Bath. So we know that family decisions can be driven by individual decision-making power. How this power is allocated within the household can be depending on many individual characteristics and some factors that we can differentiate and divide into formal and informal institutions. The literature has been looking at several factors going on, social norms, also who controls the income within the households, because apparently that creates many differences for the children's outcomes. The impact on property rights expansion, or for example, the effect of a land reform. We're looking at how children that are more severely impacted can be eventually compensated. And now, in this paper, what we do, we kind of look at a combination of these factors together. And in particular, the interaction of inheritance norms and bargaining power in affecting children labor supply in contexts which is not kind of simple, because if you think about polygamous households, you can have many firstborn. What do? We first of all, we provide a theoretical model, which is a polygamous household model, where we have that the bargaining power varies across the mother, and only the children work and provide work within the household, and that's going to impact the quality of land. And eventually, this land, which is the main asset, gets allocated with local inheritance norms to kids later on. Now we test the prediction deriving from the model using data from Nigeria. Why Nigeria? Because the polygamy rate is still very high. We have evidence that usually the first one is considered to be the most powerful. And also we have many different types of inheritance forms. Actually, we will see in a minute that there are many layers of law that coexist at the same time. As a small preview of findings, I can say that children of the first wife work longer hours than children of the mother. And this is particularly true when children are boys for the household that have land. And this is even more likely to happen when mothers have a direct access to inheritance. We will, I'll explain soon how we differentiate between direct access and indirect access to land. As I said before, the interesting setup that we're looking in this paper is this polygamous household structure. The fact that we have more than one wife allows you to explore the dynamic that going on within the household. In some sense, we have cooperation when it comes to production of resources, so that choice can be divided between the different households, kind of respecting a sort of rank within the household. But at the same time, having more than one wife can generate conflicts when it comes to the distribution of these resources. And this can heavily impact the children within the household. Nigeria is a very good example of polygamy, as I just said. In Nigeria, women tend to marry very early, and that, in some sense, makes them miss out when it comes to education and job opportunities, which makes them rely more and more on children and then husband, obviously. Despite that, women are very much involved in the agricultural production. Almost 40% of them work on land, but when it comes to the distribution and in particular the decision on what to do with this production, they are very much marginalized. So they don't get a say in how this production gets to be allocated. As I said before, the first wives are usually considered to be more powerful, and they have a little bit more autonomy when it comes to take decision for themselves and for their children. As I said at the beginning, there are different layers of inheritance setting within Nigeria. So there is the English law, common law, customary law, and especially in the north, which is the area that we'll be looking at, there is the Islamic and Sharia law. So according to the customary tradition, women are considered temporary members of the family. And for that reason, they do not get allocated specific rights. So they, for that reason, usually get access to inheritance via their kids, via children. Islamic law, in some sense, protects widows a little bit more, because although they get assigned a smaller share, they are entitled to something. Women without a son are extremely vulnerable. And so they usually remarry and enter the marriage market like second wife. But this is not a decision that they take. This is the decision that usually is made by the relatives of the deceased husband. The reason why I'm mentioning that here is that because of the lack of rights on their own, eventually the access that women can get via the children represents, in some sense, an investment for them. So having kids, and specifically a son, represents an investment in case the husband dies. So in the theoretical model that we provide in this paper, we consider one husband and two wives, but it could be easily generalized to n wives. We cap it to two also because in the data that I'll show you in a minute, the majority of the polygamous households have not more than two wives. Rarely you get to three. The wife's bargaining power is represented by the prime tenure. And depends on the rank, which is exogenous. But we have a section on the paper where we also look at the inheritance decided as a function of the bargaining power. As I said before, the children are the only one contributing to improve the land value. So they are the only one working on the land. And this is the way in which we measure the land quality. And then the children are entitled to a fraction by I of inheritance, and this will be changed depending on the inheritance mode. The results of so what we do in this model, we look at the variation of the labor supply depending on an increase of the bargaining power of the mother, and we look at the for the same child, so mother I and child I, but we look at also across mother and child. So we can consider mother I and child. As you can see, for child I, provided that the child is entitled to a positive fraction of inheritance, mother will like the child to provide more labor supply. And this is basically regardless of the monetary power. This is even more true when the child is the sole heir. So, for example, whether the child is male. At the beginning of the paper, we do not differentiate by gender, but then we kind of make this assumption. In case instead of child sharing, the role of the father and of the bargaining power of the other mother come also into play. And so mother I can decide about the labor supply of child J only if the mother J doesn't have a very strong bargaining power and if the husband is not very much interested in child J having an education. When we make the inheritance norm not exogenous anymore, but as a fraction of the relative bargaining power, we find that child labor supply is increasing in the bargaining power of the most powerful wife, which might not necessarily be his mother, but conditional on his father not being extremely interested in this guy having an education. Now, what do we test of these results? We have identified 3 testable predictions. So we want to see whether the children of the first wife eventually provide more labor supply to children of other mothers, and whether this is particularly true when there are boys. In this case, we look at the, we basically are looking at mothers having an indirect access to inheritance via kids. And this is why the gender dimension is important, because according to both customary law, Sharia, and all the other kind of inheritance norms that I mentioned to you before, sons get privilege with respect to birth anyway. Then we introduce a specific dimension and measure of inheritance for mothers. And so we look how the children labor supply changes as a reflection of a change in the bargaining power of the mother when mothers actually marry. So when they are entitled to an inheritance share of their own. And then what we do, we explore what happens to children labor supply when the inheritance norms change. And we compare 2 settings, so one which is the Sharia area, and one where which is non-Sharia and mainly Christian. And so we ask what happened to the still the labor supply of the children. This is the empirical framework. So in order to test prediction I, we estimate the labor supply of child I in household age at time t, in weight t, sorry, as a function of the first wife indicator, YIH, X, which is a vector of both child and mother characteristics. And then we have a household weight fixed effect inter age t. To test prediction 2, which should, if you recall, is when we look at the direct access of the mother with the inheritance. We introduce this inheritance indicator, IHT, and also the gender indicator, GIH. To test prediction 3, so when we differentiate according to the content, we basically estimate the same model, but both in Sharia and non-Sharia areas. The data that we use are 4 ways from the Nigeria General Household Panel Survey, which is usually called GHS, from 2010-11 until 2018-19. Here we find information on women's access to land, which is the variable IHT. We also complement this data with the Nigeria Democratic Survey, which provides us more information on wife characteristics. And then we use the GREC data and the Marbox ethnographic atlas to provide information on plot level and also information on inheritance norms. Our unical analysis is the households, which is defined as polygamous if multiple spouses are there. We can match the polygamous union member across households. And we'll look at children aged 5 to 17 for which we have information on the human capital outcomes. And to make sure that we have only polygamous households, we'll look at children from multiple wives. We'll look at households that have children from both multiple wives. So this is the sample characteristics. As you can see from 2010, in 2018-19, there are some kind of variation in how the polygamy is actually defined, but this is more due to the definition in the survey rather than a real diminishing of the polygamy in the areas in the span of sort of 10 years. As you can see, the north, which is the area in which we focus, is the one which is more likely to have polygamous households, and is also more likely to happen in rural areas. The contrary to what we thought at the very beginning when we started the structure, 52% of households live in community where women do actually inherit some land, although at the beginning this is a smaller share compared to the kids. And girls work, we also, as a feature of the sample, I can say that girls usually work less than boys when mothers are entitled to inheritance compared to when they don't. One thing that I didn't mention at the very beginning is that this working on the land can be also seen as a way to acquire rights, especially when norms are not very clear about how this allocation. So you have to think about it like a usufruct way of applying. And this is why this is kind of part of an explanation of the result that I'm showing in a minute. When we test prediction 1, we can see that the this is the way in which we label children of the first wife, and as you can see across the any specification of labor's supply, extensive marginal, intensive marginal, and labor, they tend to work more than the children of any other wife, and this is particularly true for boys. When we look at the inheritance, so when think about the panel A as the indirect access to inheritance for mothers, and panel B as the direct access to inheritance. As you can see, there's no really clear result when it comes to the women inheriting here. But when we look at the children providing, especially boys providing labor supply when women do inherit, then again it comes back as strongly significant. Changing the setup, the inheritance setup, and looking at and comparing Sharia versus non-Sharia area, we can see that when women inherit, children, especially boys, tend to provide more work. Children of the first mother tend to provide more work than others. This is something that goes a little bit against the prediction of our theory, in the sense that we expect that when norms are not very clear, bargaining power of mothers can play a bigger role. But actually, we realize that the non-Sharia area is mainly Christian, and so the first marriage is the one that is recognized anyway, so the others do not really count. And so there's no need really for bargaining power display in any writing. One of the issues that we had with this paper is to make people believe that the wife status is something that is kind of exogenous, something goes with the brain. So we have been exploring possibility that there might be some characteristics, probably even pre-marriage, that can affect the reason why you enter the marriage market as first or second wife. And so we look at the wife characteristics, education, previous marriages, or whether they do work in the house. We look at seniority, and we can say that mostly, if we find any difference, that can be explained by seniority. There's also, interestingly, find some positive associative mating. So men tend to marry women which are kind of similar in terms of education background, income background, primary, secondary education. To be even more sure about the exogeneity of the wife's status, we also use an instrument that I'm sure many of you have been seeing used elsewhere, which is the average rainfall, thinking that any kind of rainfall can affect possibly the wealth of the parents, can be, first of all, exogenous, and eventually could affect the wealth of the parents, on which unfortunately we don't have any other information, and so we use it as an instrument. As the latest check, we randomly assign the rank as a falsification test. We assign a random rank to the wives in our sample, and still the results do not change. For the sake of time, I'll tell you that we do a lot of robotics tests on the plot level measurement of considering property rights versus inheritance norm. Thinking as property rights as the ownership of land today versus inheritance rights norms or rights as ownership of the land in the future. We changed measure, looking at the Greg and Atlas data. We look at whether the results are driven by a specific type of ethnicity in our sample, more than inheritance norms. We also look at changing dependent variable rather than labor supply. We look at human capital outcomes, but there it's a more consistent patterns of outcome are not to be found. Considering that for many of the children in our sample, working hours are 0, so we're looking also different type of distributions, like the one tested here, outliers. We slightly changed the definition of the children included, rather than 5 to 17, 5 to 15 years old, and still kind of, despite all these test results, still kind of hold. So in terms of if I would like to take one thing out of this paper, it's to what we really would like to take out. Also, in some sense, the policy message is that when children are, when women do not have access or rights on their own, choices that they make towards their children might be biased by the fact that they may represent an investment for their status in the long run, when, for example, a husband might be deceased. And so, without any policy on education that is not complemented at the same time with women empowerment, might produce results which are not straightforward and not the one intended.
Thank you very much. All right. So we'll open up for questions. Please.
We enjoy your paper, and I think we will have a lot to talk, because we are also something very much related to what you're doing. So I think my main question is, are there any concern about you dealing with the possibility that the child of the first wife is actually the first child, the oldest son? So controlling perhaps for older.
No. We do have a test about firstborn, and
so it must so that was my main concern, and I think there's a way in which you can test, also looking at monogamous families. Okay. And I was very happy to see that you also look at women working off farm, because this is one of the things that we observe, is that women labor supplies differ across region with different gender norms, and that could influence also, what happened to their children, whether they have to compensate for, or somehow there is, this entering the bargaining power situation. But I saw that you do that, so
the especially the first wives are the one that usually we can say are more productive. There might be some ranking issue going on in the sense that the first wife are the one that not only work in the farm but also sometimes work outside, whereas the younger wife are usually devoted to look after the children or other chores within the house. So there might be also some kind of issues in that sort of direction.
Do you have that in your theoretical model? Because you mentioned something like the only children contributes to land.
So we had a previous version where the others used to work in the land. But what you probably say is to explore bargaining power as a function of the work in the house, and this is something that we don't. So we assume that the bargaining power is exogenous. The only thing that we change is inheritance mode. So consider inheritance not as exogenous, but also potentially as a function of bargaining power. It could be an option.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's very interesting. I do think the challenge, you touched on it, is this issue of bargaining power being endogenous, and that's what I was thinking the whole time. Well, the results you showed, those don't use the full panel effect, right? So you're not controlling. With the results you showed, are you controlling are you looking within the child over time? Using year that
no. We can't track the household over time.
Oh, you can't
cross section.
There are household identifiers for sure.
I'm not entirely sure.
So, right?
Yeah, that's an expert in the room to tell us.
Yeah, for the general household survey panel, you can link the households and the people over time.
Yeah, because that would be the most robust looking within the individual.
But then you would be looking somehow at changes. So yes, this is something of a fixed situation where the wife is always the first throughout the panel. So
but you could pick up, as they're aging. I don't know how much marriage.
Yeah, something like this that you could exploit in terms of within household. Maybe the death of the first wife, that you become the first wife.
Yeah,
that would be an interesting exercise or something.
Yeah, I would just look at that time dimension you should be able to track a household interface and also look at that variation.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. I have a question for you. Anyone else have a question? So on the model assumption, you're assuming first wives have more bargaining power, right? But then the question of giving birth to a son, sometimes there's the stylized fact or this assumption that men will decide to marry another woman because the first wife hasn't born a son. Okay, not likely to hold in this setting, but how do you deal with the concern about having a son increasing your bargaining power, perhaps within the sort of union, thinking more broadly? Then second question is about, do you have children? Do you have the relationship to the mother and the children's relationship to the mother? So are there children from outside of the household who are living, cousins or other relatives who are coming to live with the house? And can you differentiate between that? Or do you observe the relationship of the children to the mother? No. Okay.
No. So I'll start with the second question. No, we don't have information on that. So we look at children that live in the same compound, which are affiliated with a specific mother.
Right.
So any other kind of male that can be entitled to that. In some sense, we do that when we look at this test, so with the plot information, because there we kind of look at the soil quality or whether there are multiple areas for a specific plot of land, which might include children, male heir, which are not necessarily sons of any wife.
Okay.
But that's the only control that we do to secure that. In terms of the bargaining power, so in the model, we assume that in the model, we explore the gender dimension, but not as a function. So but we don't link it to the bargaining. So the bargaining power we consider as a fixed and given by the rank, not as increasing whether you have a nose.
Right. Okay, because that could be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other? Okay. Perhaps we'll move now to the next presenter, who will be Rachel. While she's getting set up, I'll give a quick introduction. So my colleague Rachel from the African Innovation Lab, the senior social scientist at the World Bank's Africa GIL. She leads GIL's qualitative research and is the thematic lead for research on social norms and gender-based violence. Specializes in the study of socioeconomic dynamics that reproduce gender inequality in sub-Saharan Africa. And she holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. And today she'll be discussing seeds of unity, examining the link between joint land titles and women's status in Western Uganda. Okay, get away, Rachel.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to you all for being here so early. This work I'm going to be presenting is joint with Michelle Coolin from UC Berkeley. It'll be a bit of a mental switch here. This is qualitative research. I know we're at the World Bank, but it's okay. This is qualitative research that was embedded within a land titling experiment in Western Uganda. I think I'm mostly going to skip the motivation and scene setting for this audience. Just to note that women's land rights are advocated both as an end, an important goal in and of themselves, as part of achieving gender equality, and also because they're associated with all these other improvements and other outcomes that we care about, right? So I mentioned that the qualitative research was embedded in a land titling project. It was also embedded within an impact evaluation, like by Mike and another colleague of mine. I'm not going to talk much about this impact evaluation, but Mike and my other colleague will be presenting it later today at 4. Right? So if you really want to know a lot about this impact evaluation, I encourage you to go to the other section. I'm just going to give like the pieces of information that are important in the context for the qualitative study. So in the impact evaluation, we wanted to understand whether and how we could encourage men to jointly title marital property with their wives. So put their wife's name alongside their own on the land title. Here, the basic offer was a fully subsidized land title for one parcel of land. And we tested a bunch of different ways of encouraging joint titling. So one way was requiring that the wife be present during this discussions of the title offer. Another way was adding some information. This was in the form of a video featuring testimonials about joint titling. And a third was making the subsidy conditional on including the wife's name. These are not the treatment arms. All this is cross-randomized. I can tell you all about it. But these are sort of the things that we were testing. And, you know, the answer to the question, is it possible to encourage men in Western Uganda to include their wives on a land title? The short answer is yes. I think there are a few take-up results that are really key to have in mind as I talk about qualitative research. So first, the demand for titling was extremely high across all treatment groups. Second, there were unexpectedly high rates of joint titling, even in the treatment arms where we didn't add this information and where it was not conditional, where the subsidy was not conditional. I should mention, though, that the rate of joint titling was much higher when the wife was present for the titling discussions, when she was not required to be present. And then the information and the condition both increased to take up a joint titling, really fairly high. So that was the impact evaluation. The qualitative research was meant to complement it. We know that it was possible to encourage joint titling. The qualitative research sought to understand, is it meaningful? Does it really matter if the wife's name is on the title? For people who study property regimes and land rights, we've known for a long time that legal rights don't guarantee control over the property if those rights are not socially recognized, if enforcement is weak, or if the rights holder doesn't have the resources to secure enforcement. So, in other words, de jure and de facto rights are not always the same. What's written on paper might not be what happens in practice. So with the qualitative research, we wanted to understand, does joint titling confer joint ownership really in practice? And further and more closely linked to the impact evaluation, what's the mechanism? What really changes with joint titling that might lead to improvements in status or welfare for the women in these household and communities? A few more conceptual notes before going on. We went into the study with a few assumptions and hypotheses. We assumed, based on research in the region, that women would probably have user rights to marital property, but not really ownership rights. So we thought that joint titling would increase the breadth of women's land rights from the more limited user rights to more expansive owner rights. We also hypothesized, based on the bargaining model, that this increase in the breadth of women's rights, the increase in their land ownership, would mean giving them greater control over household resources. That would give them a greater ability to bargain for their preferences in the household, and that could lead to improved welfare. I'm going to come back to this hypothesis at the end of the presentation. Okay, so Southwest Uganda, these statistics are actually national, not from this region, but they give sort of an idea. There is a gender gap in land ownership. Marriage in Uganda is nearly universal, tends to happen pretty early in life. And also, divorce is not uncommon. More than a third of marriages end in divorce. So when thinking about property rights and bargaining within the household, it's important to know that divorce is a realistic possibility in this setting. Okay, so this is qualitative research, as I mentioned. We did formative research in the years preceding the land titling intervention. The in-depth qualitative research happened after the land titles have been delivered. We selected 34 households from the impact evaluation survey sample, and I'll tell you more about the sample. Next slide. We chose to interview both the husband and wife from the same households. We wanted to hear two different perspectives on intra-household dynamics, then the decision about the title. We had two very skilled Ugandan researchers who conducted those interviews, who were done simultaneously in separate locations so that they shouldn't influence each other. And then in addition to those interviews with council members, we interviewed 10 local council members from different locations in this area. The local councils in Uganda have the bureaucratic authority and also, I would say, the social legitimacy to both oversee land transactions, especially for land that's not formally titled, and also they adjudicate land disputes. So these are sort of the authorities on managing land in this area. I mentioned that we sampled from the impact evaluation survey. The sample was stratified by both the treatment arm in the impact evaluation and the household's response to the title offer. So among those that were given sort of the unconditional title offer, we selected 10 households where they accepted and opted for a joint title, and 10 households where they accepted and opted for a solo title, just the husband. We also interviewed 5 households that were in the conditional arm and had accepted the joint title, and then 9 households that either refused initially or dropped out along the way because we wanted to understand some of the dynamics over time that people might change their minds about the title offer. I will highlight 4 key themes that come from the qualitative data. So jumping right in. this first one is sort of just contextual information, but women in the setting can and do own land, and people were very clear about this. For example, Charles, that's not his real name, none of these are real names. The interviewer asked him, do women own land and how do they acquire it? And he said, yes, they buy their own land or can be given by her parents. And the interviewer asked, what do you mean by given? These were really good interviewers. And Charles said, I mean inheritance from their parents. And the interviewer again asked, I thought only boys inherit from their parents. And Charles says, no, that was the old way of thinking, but girls choose to inherit these days. And we heard this over and over from both men and women. Samuel here says, it's fine, women own land. The second thing that emerged from the data that we were more surprised about was that there was an expectation that marital property would be jointly owned or at least jointly managed. And in particular, wives had to sign for all land transactions. That is beyond user rights, right? Control over the selling and buying of land is more than just a user right. Here we have a male farmer who says, these days, the laws don't allow you to sell your land without your wife's or children's approval because they must sign on the sale agreements. If your wife disagrees, you can't sell even if you have a title in your own name. And that was really key, that text coming out in the research, that regardless of whether you have a title, and also no matter whose name is on the title, the wife still has to sign the land transactions. There's a female farmer here who says the same. It does not matter if she has her name registered, she still has to sign for the land transaction. And this was also confirmed by the local council members, who again are overseeing these land transactions. Here, the local council chairman says, also me as a chairman, if I come, I will not allow to give you my stamp on your land without your wife present to agree to the selling. This has brought some peace here. This is how it has been changing, because in the past times, you would find the women not knowing about the husband selling land, but now they have to know it. And this practice of requiring the wife's signature for land transactions is rooted in law. After decades of women's rights activism for gender equality, but also very specifically about women's property rights, in 1998, there was a Land Act, and then this was updated in 2004, and it is in these legal documents that signed this requirement for the wife's signature on land transactions. What we see in the qualitative data is that in this part of Uganda, at least, that requirement is true not just on paper, but actually in practice. That women do actually have this amount of say over land transactions. So, on to the third theme. Unlike the uniform answer that we received to the question, or actually we didn't even ask that question about signing, that just came out of the data, right? Everyone told us women have to sign. When we asked about what happens to women's claims to property upon divorce, we got a lot of different answers. Mixed opinions about their ability to maintain any kind of stake in the property, and also mixed opinions about whether the joint land title would matter. On the slide are two different opinions, for example. So Martin says, if a woman divorces or separates with her husband, she has no right on the land and must go elsewhere. And the interviewer continued to probe, and Martin basically maintains the position that the wife is going to leave, and that therefore she forfeits her rights to the land. Samuel, though, told us something different. He said it depends. It depends on a few things. One, does this woman have children? If she has children, she's entitled to share on the land, because children act like a land title. It is proof that you belong to that family when you have children. So thank you for setting that up. Two, if the woman was included on the land or agreement, she must share on the land after separation or divorce. Three, how long was she in marriage? He continues. So Samuel seems to think that women do have some kind of claim to the land upon divorce, and that the land title with her name on it would make a difference. I think from the qualitative data, it's really inconclusive to us, and also seems sort of to be a bit unknown to people in the community as well. How much of a difference it would make to have a wife's name on the land title for her ability to claim an ownership stake if they get divorced. And unfortunately, this is cross-sectional, so we don't actually know what has happened over the long term in these households. I will say there's one other relevant piece of evidence in the qualitative data, which is that we asked everyone not only to explain their own decisions about the land title, but to give us their sense of what in general would make men want to co-title with their wives or not want to co-title with their wives. And there was a very consistent answer that men who think that their marriage is unstable, might not last, or who want to take another wife are those men who choose not co-title with their wives. And so that is some indication that people have fear or anticipate that the title might matter in the case of divorce. But it seems unclear to me, and perhaps unclear to them, to what extent it matters. The last theme that I wanted to highlight is kind of the flip side of that. So we asked what makes men want to co-title with their wives. And here we heard a lot about feelings of love and togetherness and sort of joint purpose. A lot about how wives have contributed over years to this household. She also deserves a stake. Here Robert said, it's love in the family. Sometimes you love your wife so much that you do anything for her, including putting her on the title. And women talked over and over again about how knowing that their husband had put them on the title, and I say it that way because it really, we asked a lot about the decision-making process, and it really seems like in most of the households, the husband had full control over who's name on the land title. There were a few exceptions. Wives who had a lot of power in their households and who bargained one way or the other. But for most of the households, it was the husband's decision. And I think this symbol of marital commitment is most evident in the story of Leonata. She explained that her husband had had a series of other relationships over time. He had a child with one of those extramarital partners. Well, but when the land titling people came, he put her name, Leonata's name, on the land title. And for her, that was game changing because she felt like she had been chosen. And she said, now my marriage is more secure. I can relax. And this is what comes up again and again. The joint title increased women's sense of tenure security, primarily by increasing their feelings of marital security. They felt like their husbands wouldn't put their names on the title if they were planning to take another wife or if they were planning to kick them out. So when he put her name on that title, it made them feel much more secure in the marriage, and that increased their tenure security. And in some cases, we saw evidence that this might even go a little bit beyond just feeling more secure in marriage. But by signaling this marital commitment, it might also encourage greater cooperation in the household. Here we have a male farmer who was asked, does the joint title increase conflicts? And he says, no, it doesn't increase conflicts in the home because when she knows you can't sell the land without her approval, she can plant crops she wants. Now that she is also the owner and everything you do on that land, you have to consult her first. Then there aren't any conflicts. And another farmer said, okay, after her name had been included on the title, my wife feels more loved, trusted, it brings cooperation in the family. So there's something about this signal of commitment that changes the intra-household dynamics in an interesting way. So to summarize the findings, first, we found that women already had a lot of influence over the management of marital property, especially over land transactions, and that they didn't really perceive that joint title was expanding the breadth of women's land rights, at least for the duration of the marriage. On the other hand, the joint titling did have an impact on women's lives, mostly because it served as a symbol of their husband's commitment to the marriage. And so that related to that, it increased women's sense of land tenure security, primarily by strengthening their marital security. So to conclude, I want to go back to the hypothesis that we started with and think about the inter-household bargaining. So we thought that this joint land title would be giving women more control over a greater portion of household resources, and that would give her a stronger bargaining position and more influence over household decisions. And that's how we would see improvements in her welfare. Of course, there's ample evidence for inter-household bargaining models. We don't see much of it here, though, in this data. What we see is potentially a different mechanism, a complementary mechanism, which is much more related to interpersonal dynamics and feelings of commitment and togetherness in marriage. The joint title seems for women to instill this sense of security in the marriage and the relationship, to encourage cooperation and inspire greater investment. So rather than making her feel like she had no power to bargain in a sort of conflictual way, it in fact changed her, perhaps her motivation or her willingness to invest in this joint household production enterprise, because she feels like over the long term, she will be able to benefit for it because she feels much more secure in marriage. Stop here.
10 seconds left. All right. Thank you, Rachel. Audience.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm curious what the wives in the households where they didn't do joint titling, what they had to say about that process. I mean, are they saying my husband is not committed to me, or is it just the lack of, the absence of saying I feel that my husband is committed to me? What was the conversation for the themes in that?
Yes, I did not highlight it here, but some of those women felt totally dejected by the fact that he chose not to put her on the title, and some of them actually have since split. We had one where it was clear the husband felt like she wasn't pulling her weight on the farm. She said she wanted to become a tailor in town. He didn't put her on the title, and she was like, this is not going to work. It was also a signal in the other direction.
So it was almost an effective title. So if they didn't have the solo title, then maybe they would be together.
It seems like they were on the already, but so I don't know. But it didn't help that he. I think maybe it was a strong signal that maybe she left earlier than she would have. Yes.
You sort of offhand said that there were some women who really had a lot of say, and I understood it was sort of in both directions. Were there reasons that women were sort of trying not to be on the title for some kind of strategic reason?
The cases where women didn't want to be on the title seemed more having to do with trust and were these people in the federal government. There wasn't a lot of that, but there was some frustration with just the program in general that led to that. Most of the time they were advocating for themselves to be on the title. And there, we didn't have many cases of this, but it was, for example, in a household where a husband had been injured and unable to work for years, and the wife was really the breadwinner. She was able to advocate.
Any more questions?
So what did the actual program say? Was there any instruction given about the divorce, what you have to plan during divorce? Because that seems like the main pathway that you would, the wife would feel like now I have a right to get divorced, get separated, I have something, and my husband knows that. And the fact that he's doing that means he loves me and all those things. So if the divorce thing was really clear, I think that what you're finding is really clear, at least in terms of pathway. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, what were they told about that? Because that's the biggest benefit.
I'm going to turn to Mike. Were they told?
Yeah, we informed every household, was fully briefed on the full implications of titling. We started actually with, every household also watched the video, which gave it's literally the same treatment, so everybody's getting the same information, and then we provided information on the implications, including in the event of rupture, death, etc. There is one anecdote from this, we've talked about in the past of we had an instance because there was a gap between the time when the household makes the offer and the decision, and then the moment in which they receive this, and this gap can take, sometimes takes months, sometimes almost a year. But we had an instance where a couple that had agreed to jointly title later divorced, and the wife, I think, moved to Kampala, and our counterparts, these very well-educated Kampala-based researchers said, so we're not going to deliver it to the wife now, right? Because they've divorced. And I said, no, that's not the way it works. We've made it very clear, so even within, our counterparts were saying, but they've divorced, so no longer, but so, yeah, that just shows sort of the extent to which those norms are really embedded.
I think it's unclear to everyone what happens in the case of divorce.
So Rachel does also want us to look at the impacts of this intervention on marital dissolution, right?
Absolutely. That would be the test of the hypothesis. Are you going back to do that?
We have data we haven't looked at it, but yeah, we will be looking at it. Yeah.
Why don't you look at it between now and this afternoon?
Yeah, later this afternoon, we can add this slide. Great. So shall we move on to, I guess, Jake, are you next in the queue? Is that right? We'll double check that. Thank you very much, Rachel. All right. So you're going by Jake, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jacob Ricker-Gilbert is professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. His research program is built around the theme of increasing agricultural intensification and productivity for small-scale farmers in the developing world. Most of his current work focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. Core topics are 1, evaluating the economic impacts of input subsidies, 2, estimating the impact of farmland markets on productivity and livelihoods, 3, analyzing the economics of smallholder farm households post-harvest decisions, and 4, studying how smallholder farm households adapt to climate change. So he'll be sharing with us this work joint with Martin Mwale.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking about gender differentiated impacts of tenure, security, and investment in Malawi. I'm going to be talking about some nuanced cultural factors related to inheritance that I find challenging as a Westerner to fully grasp. So I really appreciate having a Malawian co-author, Martin, on this paper, and I'll be presenting on his behalf. So just quick motivation. I think we know this. Land is a key factor of production. It affects rural household welfare. Sub-Saharan Africa historically has been considered land abundant. However, with rapidly growing population and changing climate, the amount of arable land is shrinking. It's raised the need for sustainable intensification practices, including intercropping, erosion control, using organic manure, etc. In terms of tenure arrangements, as we've talked about, most of the land, especially in the region we're going to be in southern Eastern Africa, is under traditional arrangements where people have user rights that are guaranteed by local leaders with no title. However, with increased commodity prices, better market linkages, and urbanization, land's becoming more and more of a commodity that's traded, rented, bought, and sold, and land prices have been rising. So it raises this big question, some of it was raised yesterday in the sessions I were in, where how will the customary tenure systems guarantee tenure security? So generally with tenure security, we expect more investment in land. The classic Besley paper showed that. Land investment has implications for productivity, food security, and poverty reduction. We're going to focus in Malawi, where tenure security can be affected by gender differentiated inheritance patterns. So in Malawi, there's both matrilineal inheritance and patrilineal inheritance. The sort of short version of matrilineal inheritance is that land is passed through the woman. The man marries into his wife's family and moves to her village, and the husband only has access to land through his wife and her family. So though land is passed and owned by women, and relative to her husband, the woman's in charge, it doesn't mean that she's necessarily in control of the land. It's her family, the wife's extended family, often her uncle, or depending on her age, it could be her brother, that is actually in charge of that land and makes the decision. In case of a divorce, so the husband leaves with nothing, including leaving the children and the land behind. So vis-a-vis the husband, the wife has more power in the matrilineal inheritance system in terms of land. In the patrilineal system, which is essentially the opposite, land is passed through men. Women move to the husband's village, and the husband, has control of the land and the children. And if there's a divorce, the wife leaves with nothing. So the question is, how do these patterns affect decisions at the household level? So we've talked about inheritance patterns, the matrilineal-patrilineal dynamic, but there's also this well-known gender productivity gap. That means that the two factors, that the inheritance pattern and the gender effect, need to be teased out from one another. So men in this context are heads of households, so they make decisions that affect the family, farming, non-farming, social. In this data, men and women tend to farm separate plots. There are a few plots in common, but I think 98% of the plots have a male or a female manager. They may supply labor on each other's plots, but in terms of who makes the decisions, it's gender differentiated. At the same time, there's this large productivity gap between men and women. In Malawi, that productivity gap has been found to be 25% for land and 44% for labor. Most of that is due to value of crop production, men growing tobacco, and also differential impact access to inputs. So tobacco is higher value, men grow it, so what they grow is more highly valued. However, what we're doing in this study is considering these differences between men and women in terms of productivity and investment across matrilineal and patrilineal inheritance practices. So comparing yields and investment for patrilineal men with patrilineal women with matrilineal men with matrilineal women. So the questions are, we use the 2018-19 LSMS data for Malawi. How do yields and their assessment of the value of their land differ by gender of the plot manager and their inheritance pattern? So again, comparing those four groups. And then how about intensification? How do the investments that people make on their plots differ by gender and inheritance practices? And the reason we use the cross-section, the most recent cross-section, is because they actually asked inheritance patterns at the household level. Earlier rounds just asked it at the community level, so it's noisy. We do test it at the community level, and the results are similar, but this more recent data gives us the ability to look at the household rather than just know. The original question was, do most people in this community practice matrilineal and patrilineal? In 2018-19, we know if the household was matrilineal or patrilineally had that practice. And with development and people moving around, there is more villages where there's mixed practices. So we contribute to the literature on tenure, security, and investment, and also the gender differentiated empowerment and yield gap literature. Okay, so just a really quick conceptual framework. Our outcome of interest, Y, represents maize yield, their assessed land value, and the investments they made in soil fertility and input use. It's affected by I, which are gender inheritance patterns, matrilineal or patrilineal, and the gender of the plot manager, G, and then other factors, household and plot level factors. So, so we have this function where the inheritance patterns are affected by your gender in that inheritance pattern. So if you're a male in a matrilineal system or a female in a patrilineal system, etc., and then your gender effect. So we expect men to have an advantage in the gender productivity gap, and that advantage is modeled by alpha. And we expect in the patrilineal system, men would have an advantage, and that effect is beta, the inheritance system effect. But so when we compare patrilineal systems, we expect men to have an advantage over their wives. So alpha would be greater than 0, and beta would be greater than 0. And for women, both of those would be negative in the patrilineal system. But in the matrilineal system, it's ambiguous because we'd expect matrilineal men to have that gender benefit from being a man, alpha to be positive, but the inheritance practice to be negative because they're disadvantaged in the matrilineal system. So beta is going to be negative. And then women in matrilineal systems is just the opposite, right? Alpha is negative, the gender differentiated effect is a disadvantage, but the matrilineal inheritance practice is an advantage. So looking at this empirically, it's fairly straightforward. There's two specifications. The first just looks separately at the matrilineal effect, beta, so you get a 1 if you're in a matrilineal practice in your household, and then alpha gets 1 if you're a male, and then we have other controls, plot level, agroclimatic. We have an individual error mu and a plot level error sigma. Then in the second specification, we tease out the differential effect for these 4 groups. So beta becomes the matrilineal female effect on yields, land value, and investment. Alpha is the patrilineal male effect and on those outcomes. And then the interaction effect, gamma, is the matrilineal male effect. And it's compared to the base of patrilineal females. And then we compare across coefficients using F tests, comparing these groups, by testing beta against alpha against gamma. All right, so how do we identify all of this? You might think that people engage in different inheritance patterns for unobservable reasons. For example, a male might try to get out of a matrilineal arrangement because he's disadvantaged there, because he's more motivated to be a productive farmer and wants control of his land. So we're worried about that threat to our identification strategy. The way we do it is the way we identify this is by a historical fact in Malawi that traditionally the groups in Malawi practice matrilineal inheritance for the most part before the Europeans arrived. Then in the late 1890s, the Scottish missionaries set up a mission in northern Malawi along the shores of Lake Malawi on a plateau to avoid malaria because it had low levels of malaria infestation. And part of their teaching were Western patrilineal values that land should go from fathers to son, and that men should own land. And that patrilineal view spread from north to south, and you can see it clearly on this map of Malawi today. The darker circles are a higher percentage of matrilineal households, whereas the whiter it is, the more patrilineal it is. So there's this clear relationship, and it's been looked at in this other study by Kudo et al. That was looking at this relationship and how the distance to the mission affect women's education and off-farm work. And in the South, women actually have higher education, more off-farm work in their study. So we argue, you can see that there's this relationship. So it's a strong IV. And we argue that since this mission was set up almost 150 years ago, it's uncorrelated to agricultural productivity affecting factors. Today, even if there's some historical, time trend or something going on, we control for rainfall and agroecological effects in the model. Okay, so this is just the first stage effect. And you can see that when you regress matrilineal and that interaction on distance to the Livingstonian mission, is statistically significant and positive. In the first column, if you're for every 100 kilometers further you are from the mission, the probability of being in a matrilineal inheritance practice increases by 20 percentage points on average. So it's a strong IV. When we look at just the descriptive statistics, my innovations didn't come out in the PDF, but that's okay. If you look at the second row of land price, you can see that patrilineal men value their land significantly higher than all other groups. Patrilineal female and matrilineal female value their land on average pretty similarly, and matrilineal males value it the lowest. In terms of yields, patrilineal men on average have much higher maize yields, over 4.1 tons on average, compared to the second highest group, matrilineal females at 3.1 tons per hectare, the third group being matrilineal men at 2.5 tons, and then the lowest being patrilineal females at 1.9 tons on average per hectare. The distance to the mission, the IV, as we saw, was strong. Just descriptively, the matrilineal households are significantly further from the Livingstonian mission than are the patrilineals, which we saw on the map. Okay, so let's look at the main effects. The effect on maize yields, which is the first column, productivity, and land prices, the second column. This is that first specification where we don't interact matrilineal and male, but on average, you see that the matrilineal areas get significantly lower yields, 99% lower yields, and have a 57% lower land price. The more interesting result is on the interaction effect. So now the matrilineal term is the effect of being a matrilineal female compared to a patrilineal female. And actually, there's no effect on productivity on average. The matrilineal females value their land lower, about 48% lower than patrilineal females. The second row, patrilineal males compared to their wives, the patrilineal females, they get about a 59% higher yield on average. So men in patrilineal communities get about a 59-60% higher return on their land than their wives do. When we compare the bottom across these groups, so the first row is comparing matrilineal women to their husbands, the matrilineal men. So husbands and wives, or wives compared to their husbands. In matrilineal areas, the wives get about an 80% higher yield than their husbands in matrilineal areas. When we can in the second row, we consider patrilineal males against matrilineal males, and the patrilineal males get about 160% higher return. And then comparing the matrilineal males to the patrilineal females, who we're thinking are, the more disadvantaged groups, the matrilineal men do better than the patrilineal females. The yield difference is about 66% lower for those groups. So the matrilineal males do the worst here. They're doing worse than all the other groups. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So in terms of yield and land prices, matrilineal men are doing the worst. When we look at the investments that they make, this is just the interactive effect, not from specification 2. The first row compares matrilineal females to patrilineal females, and in that comparison, the matrilineal women are investing significantly more in, the first one is erosion control or water harvesting. They're 29 percentage points more likely to invest in that. They're about 12 percentage points more likely to invest in using manure than our patrilineal females. The matrilineal females are about 60 percentage points more likely to use inorganic fertilizer, 8 percentage points more likely to use herbicides, and about 14 percentage points more likely to intercrop maize and legumes. Comparing patrilineal men to their wives, patrilineal men are about 16 percentage points more likely to use inorganic fertilizer than are patrilineal women. Patrilineal men are less likely to weed and more likely to use herbicides, which are agronomic substitutes in that sense. So they're using more, let's say, modern inputs than their wives. When we compare the FS across these groups, matrilineal women compared to their husbands, matrilineal men in the first row, matrilineal women are more likely than their husbands to use erosion control or water harvesting by 29 percentage points on average, 39 percentage points more likely to use fertilizer, and 14 percentage points more likely to use herbicides. So the women compared to men in matrilineal systems, women are more likely to both invest in longer-term soil fertility and use more annual inputs of herbicide and fertilizer than are their husbands. Patrilineal men versus matrilineal men. Patrilineal men more like 39 percentage points more likely to use fertilizer and about 11 percentage points more likely to use herbicides. So they're more likely to use annual inputs than are matrilineal men. And matrilineal men are actually more likely than patrilineal women to make these investments. 33 percentage points more likely to use erosion or water harvesting, erosion control or water harvesting, 15 percentage points more likely to use manure, 9 percentage points more likely to apply inorganic fertilizer, and about 7 percentage points more likely to use herbicide and 13 percentage points more likely to intercrop. So the matrilineal males here in terms of investment seem to be doing worse than their wives and the patrilineal males, but better in terms of investment than the patrilineal females. But even though they're investing more, they were getting lower yields than the patrilineal females, as we saw on the previous slide. So just to wrap up, the first set of results showed that matrilineal men got lower yields and had lower land value than all the other counterparts. They invested less than the patrilineal females, who we might have expected to be the most disadvantaged group. So I guess the take-home message then is that the matrilineal males, the fact that they have lower yields and they invest less than their wives, makes sense given their tenure and security in the matrilineal system, and it offset the expected gender productivity advantage they got from being a male, and that we've seen elsewhere in the literature. And in showing that, we've added something to the literature on tenure security and gender differentiated agricultural impacts. So in terms of the implications for policy, these ag development and extension programs that want people to invest in their soil fertility, use more modern inputs, need to understand these inheritance patterns affect investment incentives and people's interests, especially in these longer-term soil fertility investment decisions like erosion control, organic manure, etc. One side note, we didn't see a big difference in, you look at how much subsidized fertilizer people got. If you look at it by those different groups, the 4 different groups, there was no difference. In 2018, 2019, the subsidy program had actually shrunk by quite a bit. So there wasn't that much to pick up. Maybe it will be different if we have more recent data since the subsidy program has been scaled back up. But it does matter because, if you're targeting men in matrilineal systems, they may not have incentive to actually implement these practices that you want them to. And the other thing is, Malawi had this land act in 2016 that allowed people to formally title their land, but that's not going to spur investment if local communities don't respect that title. So what happens, when men in matrilineal areas go out and get a title? Does the wife's family respect that title? I think that's something that needs to be looked at if it hasn't already. So thank you for your time on that.
Thank you. Almost exactly on time. You had the 10 seconds from Rachel.
Okay.
So perfect.
Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yeah, that's very nice presentation. I'm also struck on the side of and then I wonder, because in one of your slides, there is a special pattern of this inheritance property, lowland and highland in your area. So do you think the land potential or the spatial arrangement might be something that could also influence the outcomes of this?
You mean that because you're maybe in more high productivity areas, men are more likely to there's more likely to be a patrilineal setup. Is that what you're saying?
Whatever the argument might be, because if land A has high productivity, while land B and whatever constitutes that productivity by itself, it's a spatial arrangement which is correlated to the productivity, might have feel some kind of confounding influence the outcome. So how do we react to that? That's dilemma.
Sure. So we do try to control for agroecological factors like rainfall, an agroecological zone in the model to deal with that issue. And then the argument is that this was a historical, anecdote of development that's uncorrelated with that, and we use that as an IP to try to identify the effects. We also use maize because that's a widely grown crop across the country, grown from north to south. If we used, value of production or, that included tobacco, it would have, which is grown mostly in the north and the central, that would have skewed actually the results towards patrilineal, even more patrilineal men. So we do try to control for that, but it's a valid point.
Perhaps related note, I wonder about how plots are allocated in households. Given that men and women have their own plots, the process of allocating plots in a patrilineal household may be different than in a
Yeah, absolutely. the best we can do is, control, for some of the plot measures that they have, like the sub-assessed soil quality variables, like is your plot good, fair, or poor? Is it sloped or flat? So yeah, it's another valid point. Yes.
Mine is more a clarification question. So I was wondering whether you should really distinguish by plot who is working on what, or so isn't. I wonder whether, for example, by house, whether men and wives work more kind of in the same plot, so there's more kind of interaction when it comes to product two, rather than doing, I work on this plot and you work on that plot. Because of the way it was presented, it's kind of clear separation. Whereas I wonder whether how neat is that in reality or be more blurred.
Sure. So they ask questions about who makes the majority of the decisions on the plot, and that's gender differentiated. They can also say it's co-managed.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that they don't supply labor on other people's plots. I mean, a lot of times it's women working on the plot that the husband's the decision maker on.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. So I have two questions actually. The first one is the use of the panel data structure.
Yes.
You have information on the patrilineality or matrilineality on the later stage of the data, right? So cannot we trace back the households, because it doesn't change. I don't think it will change in a very short period of time, the household structure. So what I'm thinking is that you could use the earlier periods of data points to increase your data points to improve the precision of your estimates. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here.
Yeah. That's good.
The second one is that you clearly distinguish between matrilineal and patrilineal households. For instance, if the spouses, they come from a different background, the husband is patrilineal, the wife is matrilineal, how did you control for that? I think there would be a different outcome in terms of productivity over here. How did they decide when they collected the data, when the household, the husband and the wife have a different background? Did you empirical specification control for that? I didn't really get it, but yeah.
Thank you. Let me answer those both really quickly. So the one about the panel nature of the data, that's an interesting point. I mean, we could do that to increase the number of observations in our analysis, but the actual gender and inheritance pattern is basically a fixed effect, right? The IV isn't going to do anything for us there because, these things aren't changing. The gender's not changing. The inheritance pattern isn't changing. So maybe as a robustness check, if we add these extra observations, what do we learn from, kind of without the IV, just a sort of a pool or a bigger set of observations, bigger data set. So thank you. I think that could be a nice robustness check. Yeah. So I presented your other question about if they come from different inheritance patterns. I presented this at the African Agritron conference, whenever it was in September, and some of the LSMS team was there, and this question came up, and in this round they didn't ask about if the wife was, say, matrilineal and the husband was patrilineal. It was just a household level question, but maybe, I don't know, if they're going to ask about that, they were talking about asking that in the next round to actually, because sure, if they come from different traditions, there could be a different result, but we don't have that in this round, maybe in the future. Is that?
I'll check with the Malawi team. Yeah.
I don't know if we do that yet. Yes. So it wasn't asked, but
maybe in the panel data you can then link with the previous round.
Yeah, you could.
Gather that. Yeah. For that thinking. Any other questions?
Well, this is sort of a two-finger, but what happened with the households that were mixed answer? Since you said there were quite a few that were saying, if asked if they were matrilineal or patrilineal, they said both or mixed.
Oh no. It was either or, but in some communities there are matrilineal households and patrilineal households in that community. The older data just asked about the community. They said was the majority of people in this community matrilineal.
Okay.
So we don't know about mixed.
Okay. I have survey results from 2019 in a different survey, but where if you asked individually matrilineal or patrilineal, they will say in the household some mixed. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, no, I don't
yeah.
know that.
It's
It'd be interesting to
one or the other.
You kind of already answered this a bit, but what happens if you don't do these fields, but you do that one too?
Yeah.
It's clear what would happen in the male matrilineal, right? But I'm curious about, because it's probably a such an important driver of the gender gap, what it looks like if you.
Yeah, I mean, it would be skewed towards patrilineal men because the North and the Central are looking for tobacco, and the returns to tobacco are, for those that grow it, are much higher. So you could think of this as like a lower bound, gender differentiated.
So like the matrilineal women, are they growing tobacco?
Much less. I mean, there may be some, but it's much less.
Yep.
But to follow on that, like the yield gap might be that matrilineal men are similarly engaging with cash crops. And so their maize yields are low because they just don't care about maize.
Yes, but I don't know what, like in looking at like returns to investment in Malawi, there's nothing that comes close to tobacco. If you're growing any kind of cash crop, it's gonna drive those results. I mean, that's what drove these previous results in the Killage paper and the Palacio Lopez was, the value of crop. And you're right, it's the crop choice. So again, ours would be the lower bound effect.
I'll use my broad. Oh, go ahead. Yep.
So my question is more about what mechanism you have in mind. So when tenure security comes to mind, it's always about long-term investments or a lack of that sort of. But here, for example, you also find effect on mostly short-term. So why wouldn't someone fertilizer when the returns are immediate? There's no risk of expropriation of those short-term.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like for example, why matrilineal men invest less in their wives in fertilizer. Yeah, I mean that's a good question. It could be that they don't expect as high a return because they haven't invested in the longer term complementary things like intercropping. Yeah,
You can measure more like this complementary longer term.
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, something we could go back in the data at least and look, data in the past, these people, were they less likely to use erosion control, water harvesting, organic manure? Those things can provide that complementary benefit to inorganic fertilizer.
Yeah.
This year. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
So I'll ask the last question. With your specification, I may have missed this, but it's the inevitable exclusion restriction question, right? So with your instrument, you told us earlier that it's correlated with education, with off-farm income, off-farm work, right? So are you controlling for like individual level characteristics as well of the male and female farmers?
We do have like age,
education. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Okay. We should probably move on to our final speaker, Jessica Wells, who will be presenting He Says, She Says, the GPS Says, Gender Gaps in Agricultural Survey Responses in Ghana. One moment. Pull up So Jessica is a research scientist in Aid Data's Research and Evaluation Unit, where she conducts research at the intersection of gender and development. She's a co-creator of Aid Data's new Gender Equity and Development Initiative, which focuses on bringing Aid Data's geospatial and research expertise to gender development research. She works on projects analyzing land tenure systems and gender dynamics, as well as utilizing Earth observation data and impact evaluations. Look forward to talking with you about that. Her background is in public policy.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, and I get to be the last speaker. So hopefully everyone stays awake. So today I will be talking about gender-related bias in agricultural surveys. This was done in Ghana. This is joint work with my colleagues over at Aid Data. Aid Data, just for background, is a research lab based at the College of Women.
All right. So this work kind of stems from a long line of literature. I'm just going to give a couple of examples for brevity today. But we do know that when couples are asked on the same survey to give their responses, that we will find disagreement between spouses. And we see this in Ambler et al. 9% are disagreeing on whether or not who owns the agricultural land. 38% are disagreeing on whether someone owns the livestock. 39% disagree on who makes decision over agricultural production. And in Mexico, we find that 11% disagree on whether or not the household owns non-house land. And 26% disagree on if that household owns farm animals. What I found surprising in that same study is that 22% disagree on whether or not the household owns a refrigerator. So something that you might think is pretty obvious and that there should be consistent answers to. Often we find that couples disagree on even these most basic characteristics. However, that's looking at disagreement, but we want to take this a step further. We want to know, is there actual bias? So we can see that there is disagreement between the couples, but in order to assess bias, we need a third independent observation for which we can compare these survey results to and check to see if there's bias. And unfortunately for us in the literature, there isn't much on actual bias in response rates among the couple. And so we hope to fill this gap using this paper. So in agricultural surveys, these are often very large. Only one member of the household is usually asked to fill out the survey and provide the responses. Often they ask for the most knowledgeable member of the household, which predominantly is the male household member. Even in cases where both members of the couple are surveyed, it's unclear how are we supposed to use these survey reports if there is disagreement. What do? We know it's there. So what? Which one should we use? How do we control for that? So our contribution here is to document that even in these agricultural surveys, there is spousal disagreement. We do find that on basic characteristics about the plots. Things like the number of plots. Things that you think would be easy to know, but actually we find disagreement within couples. And then next we use a GIS collected data about the plots themselves. We use a GPS plot walk to then use that as our third independent observation to compare some survey results to and see is there actually bias in these survey responses. For background about our sample, we are looking at couples in northern Ghana in 3 regions. And to be in our sample, both members of the household couple have to make a decision about agricultural plots within their household. It doesn't have to be the same plot. So often couples will have many plots of land. Husband might make some decisions on one plot, a woman might make decisions on another, or maybe they are working together making decisions across household plots. But both of them have to be making those decisions to be in their sample. Polygamy does occur in northern Ghana. So in this particular case, if there are multiple wives, we randomly select one wife amongst all of the wives who meet our eligibility criteria to participate in the MARS survey. And just a brief note, our sample villages have recently been targeted to receive a small earth dam as part of the One Village, One Dam project. So while our couples might not be representative of all couples within the region, they are representative within the sample of villages that are receiving the small earth dam. And we survey over 1,200 different couples. So in order to assess bias, we need several pieces of data. The first piece of data is a household survey. And as I mentioned, we are going to be surveying men and women. We do this surveying separately, so hopefully that they are not overhearing their answers. Of course, we can't guarantee that, but that was our intent. And we asked for a retrospective plot history. So we asked about all of the plots that the household owns, and we asked everything on these plots about their size. Was it less fallow? What kind of crops are being grown? Who is making the decisions over these plots on a variety of different measures? Who owns the plot? I will say that for ownership, this is a question we get often is, How do you define ownership? And I think that's a really important question here, at this particular conference. For this survey, we actually did not provide a definition of ownership. So ownership is left to the respondent to decide if they are an owner. I think in future work, we'd love to clarify that. We've learned a lot. But for this purpose, it is just merely the respondent's response to ownership. And then we also need GPS data about plot boundaries. So here in this image, you see two of our enumerators. They are going out with GPS loggers, and they are going out with the husband or the wife. And where possible, this was done separately. So the husband and his enumerator is going out collecting the GPS plot boundary data as well as plot corners. And then the wife is doing similarly. There are a few instances where men and women would not separate in order to go and collect the plot boundaries, so that is done together. And we take the boundary walks and the plot corners because in piloting we found that sometimes there is distortion with either of these points, so we wanted to be able to validate them. For this, we find that the boundary walks are actually sufficient and work very well. And so here you can see two different images. And you can see that there are two red lines going around the plot. One is for the man, one is for the woman. In this particular case, we can see that these plot walks are very similar. There's a high degree of agreement between the spouses. What I will say is this is not representative of our data. We actually find that there's a lot of kind of disagreement on these plot boundaries, which we will get into as well. So first, I want to talk a little bit about disagreement. Do we find that there is disagreement that agrees with the established literature? And what we are looking at here is the reported number of household plots. So something I thought and my team thought there would be strong agreement between couples about how many plots was their household managed. What we find is 26% of couples actually disagree. So everything across that diagonal in that dark gray is where there is agreement. Everything outside of that diagonal is areas of disagreement. So we see this in the number of household plots. We might then think, well, what about plot boundaries? Do we agree on the plot boundaries? So to be included in this scatter plot, what we have to have happen is that there is some degree of overlap between the husband's and the wife's plot boundary walk. If they don't have any overlap, they're not included here. So what we see in this is on the x-axis, we have the overlap divided by the female walk path area, and then we have the same for male. So in the bottom left-hand corner at 0, 0, very little overlap. These are probably mistakes, we're not quite sure what's going on. And then at that top right corner, this is where there's strong agreement and overlap. And then along kind of the top and the side are, plots where a woman has a smaller plot identified in a larger male area plot, and then the same on the other side. And so what we find is we find plot walks like these on the side where we can see that there is, in this top right image, we have a large plot area that's been demarcated. It's mostly within an even larger plot. Or we find things that happen in the bottom where one member of the household is identifying two smaller plots that's within one larger plot. And one of the reasons that we have to look at this is because our respondents, they are answering the survey, they are recalling in their mind the plots that the household own in their own particular order. Okay, so they're going through their plots in one order, the other spouse might be going through it in a different order. So what we have to do in order to get that to line up with our survey results and with each other, the best we can, is to look at this overlap. So it's not perfect, but this is what we're going to use from here on out. And then the rest of the results, I'm going to be focusing on couples for which there's 90% agreement and overlap over these plot boundaries. So we're kind of going to restrict to this upper corner for which we are feeling much more confident that they're talking about the same plots around. So next we're going to look at disagreement in reported plot size. At the bottom we have female reported plot size minus the actual plot size that we've taken from our GPS. And we have the same for males. What is important here is that the axis 0, 0, right? This is where we have males and females agreeing about the same size of the plot, and it agrees with what we've demarcated as the plot area. Everything along that diagonal then assumes that the man and the woman agree, but it doesn't agree with what has been tracked. So what we see above the diagonal line here is that males are reporting, greater plot sizings. We see vice versa for females as well. Next, we'll look at disagreement in reported maize productivity. So here, I don't actually have an independent measure to share about maize productivity. So instead, we're going to be comparing male responses to female responses. So again, on the diagonal, we're going to see that there is same reporting. And then we are going to move to ownership. What is it that we're seeing in couples about ownership? I think that's an important one here. So we find that 46% of couples disagree about women's ownership status. So on the diagonal here again is agreement. Everything off the diagonal is not agreement. What is interesting here is that this is driven mostly by this, when females indicate that they have partial ownership and males are saying they have no ownership, right? And maybe unsurprising, and I think we'd love to dig into that further in future rounds of this if we can unentangle what does ownership mean. But then we want to also take a look at female decision making. Do we see agreement there? So here we find that 32% of couples disagree about women's decision-making power over these plots as well. And this is questions ranging from, do you use fertilizer? Who makes those decisions? What kind of crops are you growing? Who makes those decisions? So we're going through kind of a range of questions here. And what we find is that this is also being driven in part by women reporting that they have no decision-making power over these plots, and men are reporting that women do have some type of decision-making power. So this is helpful in understanding that there is disagreement. We see this on a variety of different measures between men and women. This is supporting what's already been documented in the literature. So what we want to do now is think about bias. So how can we measure that, and how do we utilize the data that we already have? So in order to measure bias, in each of these next set of regressions, what we're essentially going to do is we're going to look at the impact of gender and on decision-making status while controlling for some of our GPS and plot characteristics that we're assuming to be reality. So in this particular case, we are looking at plot sizes. That's pretty easy to use. We can use the male survey responses as well as our GPS collected data. And what we are finding here is that men are reporting greater plot sizes than do women. An indication of bias in this particular study. The second is that we want to look at distance to plot. So this is a little bit more noisy. In our survey, what we have are reported distance in minutes, but what we have from our GPS data is that we can look at the household point and then the point of the boundary walk of the plot, and we take the distance from the household to the nearest point on the plot. So in this particular case, we use it as a control variable, but kind of gets at this same question. What we see is that men are reporting shorter distances to plots than are women. And now we're going to look at fallow plots. So in our original idea and our research design, what we had hoped to do was to create some sort of measure using NDVI to look at whether or not a plot is fallow. Unfortunately, we conducted our survey right as the rainy season was kicking off, and so there was a lot of cloud cover in the satellite imagery we had hoped to use. So instead, we used a remote sense measure of fallowing, which is binary in this case, so that's determined by an algorithm deciding whether or not that particular plot is fallow. So when we include that particular measure, what we see here is that men are actually reporting more planting and intercropping on these plots through our remote sense measure that we indicate are fallow. So we're saying these plots are fallow, men are reporting that they're actually planting and there's intercropping going on these particular plots, more so than women. And next, we're looking at particular types of crops. So here we have millet, groundnuts, and maize. And on millet and groundnuts, but not on maize, we also see that men are reporting greater harvests than do women. So another instance of bias here. So in conclusion, what we find is that there is significant disagreement between the couple about these basic plot characteristics. I think it was a greater extent on the number of plots than we had previously thought, and that there is gender-related bias that is happening on these agricultural plots. Men are over-reporting kind of these plot sizes, are reporting shorter distances to plots, cropping that is going on fallow plots and the like. And really this research kind of helps shed light on kind of the challenge and maybe the inherent danger when we are only surveying one member of a household. And what does this mean for the future? So as we're kind of looking forward, this is our first look at agricultural gender-related bias in surveys. We want to know, do we see this in other places? And then more importantly, what does that mean in terms of how do we utilize these large-scale agricultural surveys that rely only on one survey response? Is there something that we can find about the couples in particular? Some couples are more prone to bias than others. Are there characteristics of these couples that we can look for, or kind of other things in the future? So more to come, but would welcome your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Whenever I see papers like this, it sends shivers down my spine because, we rely on self-reported measures for many of our analyses. So, but it's very important. First question, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. So I have a few questions. So one is that I think you mentioned that some people are following polygamous situations.
Yes.
And then you only conduct a survey with one wife. Mm-hmm. So maybe one of the points is that maybe husbands may include the plot which jointly own with another wife. So that's why it's kind of a mystery among the men. And the second point is that because the definition of the ownership of the land is totally depending on their own decision. So maybe some people think, how did you treat if the land is rented out, or someone renting from other people? So that's my question.
Yeah, so we do that. So on rental, I guess those could technically be included, but what is different here is, we're asking that the husband and the wife, or at least one, have to actually make decisions about that plot, something, whether it's the inputs or what to do with the harvest or the crop. So hopefully these are plots that are actually being managed in a household. But I guess that could happen. We didn't see in just talking with a lot of responses, there wasn't very much for the polygamy question as well. Yes, that could potentially happen. That's, I think that's just one of the design flaws maybe, or challenges in this. We didn't have time or resources to interview all of the wives in these families. So what we tried to do is the best we could by asking, does the wife that's selected and the husband that's selected make decisions on at least one plot of land?
I have many questions. It's super interesting, but I'll keep it to one for now. No, I was just curious, and maybe it's not possible with this, but I was curious if you see lower bias on plots that are directly managed by that individual. I know you have a lot of disagreement on this, but
I think that's kind of the hard part, right? Is deciding then who is correct about those plots. So what we could do is then look at, well, do you say, does the wife say that they manage it, or does the husband say they manage it? And then take a look and compare. But again, what we're trying to highlight is that there's also this disagreement about who either owns it or makes those decisions.
From the LSMS, I think of the data collector hat. I'm just trying to figure out if there is an advantage to say asking these questions to the person who is most knowledgeable, or if there's a better respondent selection strategy, perhaps.
That's what we'd love to dig into ourselves and try to understand.
Go ahead and then we'll come this way.
I guess like a follow-up to that, because there is only limited time and resources, and you want to ask the most important question. It would be helpful to know, like, this measurement error and where you're tracing the plot boundary. What does that mean for yield? What does that mean for, get the best estimate? It seems like this is, that's a separate paper actually from this decision making.
this first part could contribute to the measurement error kind of literature, and then the other one could be on decision making.
So we had actually hoped to be able to use satellite imagery to look at yields. It's a lot of work. I'm using satellite imagery to look at crop yields. Unfortunately, the cloud cover has been a significant challenge. So, I mean, to compare, right, we want survey information about what they say the yields are, and things like that. We would have loved to be able to somehow incorporate satellite imagery to cross-check some of that, which is difficult. But yes, there also are these kind of two separate pieces, the decision making and then these outcomes of lots.
This way, maybe come back if we have time. Yes. Yes, please.
Oh, okay, great. I just wanted to ask if you asked at all about confidence level. So if women were ever unsure about anything, because that's something I found in a lot of my work, that a lot of women occasionally will be like, oh, no, I don't really know the plan. I'm not really sure about the boundaries. I'm so sorry, I don't know these things, or they weren't like totally sure. So I don't know if you can see that information at all.
We did not, but that is a great point. Although would it lead to more kind of uncertainty? Because I would imagine there would be a large response to that particular question, uncertainty. But that's a good point.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I've got one question of clarification when you look at the boundaries, and I'm saying that men overestimate compared to women. So if you look at the reported sizes of the plot and then the GPS, like do you compare like women reported to what women drew, or like did you try to combine the responses or check that like for like the correct boundary? So I was just trying to understand if you have two boundary measurements, which one is like the one you
So that's a great question. The one that we utilize is actually just what we consider the true boundary, which is not perfect in this case, is where there is 90% overlap between the husband and the wife in their boundary walks themselves. Not perfect. We tried to line it up with satellite imagery as well to see, like, could we trace what we think it could have been, but that turns out to be very difficult and messy to do when you have this many. So the best we could do was to take only instances in which the husband and the wife match 90% of the time, and then run our analysis on that kind of restricted example.
Come back this way. Yep.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very comprehensive report of measurement here. My question is related to the disagreements. Are you measuring disagreements just for instance, if it is 1 square kilometers, 1 square meters, do you consider it in the land size? Do you consider it as a disagreement? Because those disagreements could be ignorable.
It's a good point. It could be just noisy from the enumerator walking around with their GPS logger trying to take it, and they're following the path the best they can.
Yeah.
Yes, in this case, that will still be considered disagreement. We find that, it's never really just so small that we might attribute it just to enumerator error. It's on a much wider scale than that. And that's why we use 90% as our threshold instead of saying like 95 or 98% agreement, hopefully to allow for some of that buffer of enumerator errors.
Mm-hmm. I think that the question is also, it's very important to see the ownership aspect of it, because there is a well-documented literature on that. When you own something or when you work on something, you know what's cultivated there, the size of the area and all these things. A colleague of mine at Ethiopia, they did research on livestock count. They did an actual count of small livestock, an actual count of larger livestock, and they asked the male and female household members to report how many small and large livestock they have. They did that experimentally, and they find that women owns the small livestock, and they tend to get right answer on the small livestock, and male owns the large livestock, and men more likely to report, the right response from large livestock. So I think it's very important to see that ownership aspect of it. so that we can learn, something out of that. So the last question is the implication of that. I work most of the time on surveys. So what we do is that women relevant questions, for instance, if it is nutrition, we ask women, right? And the rest, man relevant questions to the man, right? So in case of this disagreement, what would you suggest for survey people who work on the survey? We see the disagreement is huge. Yeah. So what should we do?
It's a great question, and this is one that we want to investigate further. So it's kind of hard to share this kind of research because then there's the question of, well, what do we do about it? Well, how do we fix it, right? And we just completed this within the last couple of years, so we're still thinking about this question ourselves. I don't have an answer for you. What we'd like to be able to do is to try and replicate surveys like this that are improved upon and get at this question. And then, are there characteristics of couples that we can see that are correlated with this type of bias that we can think about when we go out and survey? Or, what do we do from here? So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have the second piece that more addresses that particular question.
We're running out of time, so we're going to take like one or two more questions. If you want to group them, anybody else? So you two can go, and then we'll hand it over to this.
So we did a similar, well, not similar. This is more targeted at this question, but we had some work where we had a land area measurement component, and we had a questionnaire module on social desirability bias. Mm-hmm. And we see very different indicators of social desirability and impression management between men and women, suggesting men, I'll have to go back to it, it doesn't work, but basically men overstating to make their image look good, so this is maybe one thing that could be further explored in this context. And then my second was more just a question that's tangential, but like looking at these images, you might also be able to unpack a little bit how different people are understanding the definition of plot, because some of these look like they have a different.
Yeah. One thing I failed to mention is that what we found is often women would cite a small garden plot in front of their household as a plot of land that their household manages, that they directly make decisions over. Often that plot was overlooked by the husband. So we definitely saw that. And it's a lot of times these smaller garden plots that are out there.
Super quick. Do you have any questions about boundary disputes? And if you don't, I think that would be interesting to add to the future. If there is truly disagreement about where the boundaries are, that could be something that drives boundary disputes.
That is also a good point. Yes, I'm all ears to other questions now.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our speakers for these excellent presentations and